Welcome to Through Ancient Eyes, where I share unexpected insights on the ancient Near East culture to uncover how much better our God is compared to any other power that we might ever want to put our hope and our trust in. I'm Gail Heaton, and if this is your first time, welcome to this lesson. So I want to give you a better understanding about the culture in which the Torah was given. Because if you know what the ancients were up against, then I think you can get a better sense of how God met them where they needed him to, right? And when you can see what he has done for them, I think you're going to just find that you'll trust him just a little bit better to meet your own needs too. So we are in Parsha Noach, which is the name for Noah. Let's talk about the Tower of Babel. The reason I'm choosing this one is I think that most of us have missed something significant with this tower because we've not seen it through ancient eyes before. And it all starts with the way that we envision this tower. Genesis 11:4 says, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth.'" Okay? A tower that reaches to the heavens. Now, I'm going to guess you're picturing an ancient structure that stretches up really high into the sky, right? I mean, most people picture it this way. And I think this is an example of where our modern and our Western brains can have a misunderstanding of what the A&E authors were trying to communicate. But it's not entirely our fault, okay? Because the authors of the scriptures assumed that their audience would know all of these things already, the cultural pieces, right? Without them having to explain it. I mean, they didn't know that like thousands of years later, we wouldn't live like they did, right? And we have to recognize that God in his wisdom and his sovereignty, he didn't inspire the authors to give those details, right? So I don't remember where I first heard this from, but this person gave this example of our current word, Google, right? Google's a verb, means looking stuff up. I'm going to Google that, right? Well, Google had an original meaning. It's the number 1 followed by 100 zeros. That's a Google, right? And, if the world stands in 1,000 years more, who knows what Google will mean, right? So the ancients knew what these towers look like, but we have to Google it. And the biblical scholars have had to rely on archaeological sources to kind of find out what the ancients knew. But what's awesome is that we've really learned so much from them. Like even in the past 30 to 50 years, our knowledge has increased considerably as to how the ancients lived and viewed things. So what I want to do with this lesson is tackle the question, what's the big deal that the people built a tower? But before we get to that, I wanted to share something really interesting that I learned about what the ancients thought in regard to the language of Hebrew. You know how in this narrative of the tower, in the end, God confounds the languages, right? Well, apparently there's this commonly held belief, even up to the time of Yeshua, that the Hebrew language was the language of creation, but it was lost at the confounding of the languages at the Tower of Babel. But God then taught Hebrew to Abraham, who then passed it down throughout his generations. Now, it turns out that there's actually many really interesting stories and legends about Abraham that are what we call extra biblical. So, in other words, there are stories that are found in sources other than the Bible. Now, this idea that God taught Abraham Hebrew, that comes from the book of Jubilees. Now, Jubilees was written in Hebrew by an unknown Jewish author sometime around the first century BCE. So that's Yeshua's time. Now, the book of Jubilees gives summaries and it paraphrases, and it also gives traditional commentaries of biblical stories like from Genesis. But it also kind of weaves in legends and folklore that goes like really far beyond the biblical text. Now, the value of books like Jubilees isn't in us looking for facts, right? Facts on the life of Abraham or Moses or anyone. The value is that it shows ancient belief of that era. It shows how people thought about things, right? It's like another glimpse by looking at the literature. It's a glimpse into the world that is so different from us and happened so long ago. And there's value in that, right? So we can see what many people in Yeshua's day believed, right? And we can see how those ideas formed a foundation of their understanding of the world, all right? So with that little bit of cultural insight, let's move forward. So the source for today's lesson is from John Walton. One is a research article that he wrote. Where I can, I'm going to give you the names of some of the research articles and the book titles, because again, I want to encourage you, as you're interested and as you're led, to dig in deeper to some of these sources. So one article he wrote is for the Bulletin for Biblical Research. It's called The Mesopotamian Background of the Tower of Babel Account and Its Implications. And then the other parts for this lesson are from his book, Ancient Near East Thoughts in the Old Testament, Introducing the Conceptual World of the Hebrew Bible. Excellent book. I highly recommend that book. Okay, so in the ancient Near East, in the A&E, at the time of the building of the tower, first thing to know is that cities, they weren't laid out like how we know today. So for example, people didn't live inside the city. They lived outside the city, and the public buildings were inside the city. And these public buildings were constructed around sacred towers, okay? These were pyramid-like structures, pyramid-shaped structures called ziggurats. And they were designed and they were built specifically to entice the gods to descend to earth and meet with humanity. Okay? So there's clue number one as to what the big deal was about the people building a tower. And the second clue is found in the language of the structure of the tower itself. Okay? So Genesis 11:4 describes Babel as or the tower, as a tower with its top in the heavens. But what's interesting is that this expression isn't meant to describe the tower's height. Okay? It wasn't meant to describe how it looked. It describes its purpose. Okay, so remember our very first lesson, right? In ancient thought, the purpose of the thing was the important part, not how it looked. And Dr. Walton, he writes this: throughout Mesopotamian literature, almost every occurrence of the expression describing a building with its head in the heavens refers to a temple with a ziggurat. So we know from cuneiform descriptions and reliefs that ziggurats were considered to be a link between heaven and earth, acting as heaven being the abode of the gods and earth being the abode of humans. So it was acting kind of like as a gate or a portal between this realm of the gods and the realm of mankind. Cuneiform, that's that ancient script writing on clay tablets. So what we can see is that these ziggurats had names, and their names tell you the purpose, right? And they served as staircases between the gods' realm and humans' realm. Okay, so for example, there's this ziggurat that's in southwest Mesopotamian, and its name meant house temple tower. There's one in Nippur, which is an ancient Sumerian city, and that one was named, translated, the name is house binding heaven and earth. And then another one at Babylon was named Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. So the ziggurat was a structure built to support the stairway, and it's the stairway that was the main thing, because that was believed to be used by the gods to travel from one realm to the other. Okay. Interestingly, the ziggurat itself didn't have, like, it was filled with dirt, there wasn't anything on the inside. And the stairway led to the top, which was this gate of the gods, that entrance to the divine abode. All right. And the structure and the stairs was taken care of by priests for the purpose of providing the gods with things that they would need to refresh them along the way of their journey. So food, place to rest, place to sleep, that kind of thing. There was a small room on the top of the ziggurat, and it had a table and a bed, and the food would go there, specifically to attend to the gods' needs. All right. So this is something I want you to catch here. The structure was built for the purpose of taking care of the gods. Now, I know I've said that several different ways, but that's important, because to build a ziggurat is to declare that the God that you're trying to invite in needs these things that the builders provided. So that's another clue. So what's so wrong with building a tower anyway, right? Well, John Walton writes that the evil that was behind the tower at Babel, it wasn't only the idolatry that came with it, okay? But it was more like how it denigrated or degraded the character of the God of creation, all right? Because to build him a tower implies three things, okay? Number one, he needs an enticement to visit. Like, he wouldn't be interested otherwise, unless he's enticed to come down. Secondly, this implies that his only access to the earthly realm is through a specific portal that's made by mankind. And three, the implication is that he has needs like the gods around. Okay? So to consider God on par with the multiple gods in these ways, you can see how that was an affront to his name. In Hebrew, Shem. It's in ancient Near East thought, your name is your character, your essence. It's who you are at the core, right? But it's these other gods, not the God of Israel, that needs enticements and specific entry points and access to food and clothing and a house, right? None of those things that God could provide themselves. The gods of the times were considered able to be pampered and able to be flattered and therefore manipulated. The gods were seen as needy and fickle and easily swayed by bribery. And usually bribery was to keep the gods away from the people and from harassing them too much, interestingly. So I want to share this because I want you to think about the contrast between that, how they view their gods, and our God of Israel, and what he tells us about himself and what he has already told us about himself, right? He desires intimacy and closeness with us. He makes the first move in the relationship, right? So I heard it said by Valerie Moody. She's a wonderful Torah teacher. She has this amazing book on kingdom prayer. And she says that we can think of prayer, talking with God. Prayer is always a response, right? We don't initiate a conversation with God, because what we're really doing each time is we're responding to the conversation that God started at creation. So Valerie Moody goes on to bring out this amazing aspect of Yeshua, the living word, saying that he's the living conversation. Isn't that awesome? So no, our God doesn't need an enticement to come to us, right? So remember that next time, if you wonder if if he should be bothered by you talking to him. In fact, God doesn't need anything in the sense of what these other gods needed, right? He's all sufficient, and he's beyond human time and space. So what this means is that God is not limited to a specific access point in order to come into the physical realm, and certainly not one initiated by humans, right? He takes care of us, not the other way around. And that would have set him as distinct from any of these gods in the A&E. And that would have set him as the most worthy, or the only one worthy of allegiance. Now, a lot of times we don't think that we have gods in our life comparable to the ancient Near East gods. But, I want to encourage you that I think a case could be made that our corporations, our sports and entertainment heroes, our political leaders, and any power that we rely on for our purpose, our identity, and our sustenance, those are modern day gods, right? So I want to challenge you, as well as me challenging myself. I wonder if we are guilty of wrong assumptions about God's character too, like those tower builders were. Our theology in modern times, it may preclude us from believing that God needs to be enticed to meet with us without us bribing him. But have you ever shied away from praying about a certain issue because you think he's not interested, right? Or have you ever heaped praise onto him? Or you've done like some of the wonderful walks and works of Torah so that you can gain favor with him, like to do it for that reason? Something to think about. And we might not believe that God requires an access point to visit us, but do you ever act like you think that his reach into that little certain part of your life is limited? And, how many areas in your own life do you think that you can keep closed off to him, right? Psalm 139, 7 through 12 says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you, and the night will shine like the day. For darkness is as light to you." So, we may not believe that God has needs that we must attend to, but how good are you and I at letting him be involved in all of our needs, right? Do you ever think, well, surely there's some things that we have to do ourselves because he's either disinterested in that or he's incapable of affecting change in my life in that area? Have you ever thought, well, God's got more important things to do with his time than to help me in this? And you know, when you think about those important people in your life and how if they have failed to meet your need in an area, do you often turn around and think that God is going to probably fail you in that same area too? Or you don't even ask him to help you with that because of the human failures? And, you know, when we're confronted with a need to change something about ourselves, how many times do we not even like try to ask for his help to change? And we say something like, well, I've always been this way. You know, I'm not going to change, right? These are some examples, I think, modern day examples of how we also can miss the mark on understanding God's true character, right? So the other thing that we learn in this Torah portion this week is that the people rebelled against God's back to Eden plan of redemption by building this tower. So after the flood, you know, God had commanded humanity once again, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Genesis 9:1. Thereby moving out into the world, performing acts of righteousness and justice, right? So be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. In that sense, that was God's call in the original Eden mandate, and that still stands for us today, right? Because fruitfulness goes beyond procreation. It means bringing heaven to earth through acts of righteousness and justice as God would do. So instead of obeying that, humanity rebelled against his plan to restore Eden, that closeness of us and him. And the people in this narrative, they insisted on staying where they were and building a house to take care of God. And it was, I build this house, I bring down the God of Israel, and therefore that would give me a name for myself in doing so. So they tried to fit God into their image, you know, as the saying goes, instead of conforming themselves to his image. And so God would thwart their plans of tyranny, but at the same time, he's moving forward with his plan, and he calls a people to himself, right? And at this point on, from this point on, it's not going to be the nations anymore. It's going to be, he's going to set apart a particular people, right? And it's after Babel that Abram, later called Abraham, that he's called out of Mesopotamia. That's the heart of this rebellion that we're talking about. And it was in Abram where the seed for a new nation, Israel, was to continue this journey back to Eden, walking in the garden, having that intimacy with God. And God's call of Abram is God's first step to bring the nations back under the care and the sovereignty of God, not these other gods, right? Now, God had said that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through Abraham's descendants. So those who are going to be blessed by Abraham's family, those were the descendants of the ones scattered at Babel. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. So we, the at least spiritual children of Abraham, right, we're called to be a blessing to those same nations. I've been taking this some studies at the Israel Bible Center online with Dr. Nicholas Shazer, and he makes this really interesting point connection that at the beginning of Exodus, it recalls the Hebrew of this Genesis 11 to show that Egypt is the new Babel, and that God will choose Moses to carry on Abraham's call. And he makes this connection because of words that are used in the Hebrew. The tower is built using Levanah and Chomer. I'm not pronouncing that right. We translate that as brick and mortar. That's Genesis 11:3. And the very next time Scripture uses these same words in the Hebrew, the brick and mortar, it's in Exodus concerning the Hebrew slavery. It says the Egyptians made their lives, the Hebrews, made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick. That's Exodus 1:14. So the professor says that we're supposed to make this connection with this repeated use of the word brick and mortar. So what we're doing is we're being taught that what began with Abraham, continues with Moses. And then, much later we get the prophet Zephaniah, and he envisions this time where God will repair this rupture among the nations that occurred in this narrative of our Torah portion, and will return them to the sole worship of God, and where they're performing acts of righteousness and justice to this world that so desperately needs it. So Zephaniah 3:9, this is in the King James. Usually when I'm reading something, it's usually in the NIV, and I'll try to always tell you what version it is. And I always recommend that you look these up in different versions, because you'll get slightly different nuanced meanings. For then I will turn to the people a pure language, that they may call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. So where it says pure language, or other versions will say clear language, that's Saphah. And there's a connection to this Genesis 11:1. The whole earth had one Saphah, one language. So Zephaniah here is recalling the confusion of the languages in our Genesis account. And the confusion, of course, as we've been saying, was the consequence of defaming the character of God, saying he's like the other gods of the nations, and saying, in effect, by building this tower, we can kind of tame him, and we can build this structure that can manipulate him to our bidding. And in doing that, we'll build a name for ourselves. So Zephaniah is saying to his original audience that there's a future day that comes when God will remove the confusion at Babel and return the earth to one language of worship. Now, most of us believe that this is saying that Hebrew will be restored as the language of humanity in worship and service. Everyone will speak Hebrew. That's one of the great motivators I have for learning it now. And I'm not saying it's not also true, but I think the deeper point in this passage is that it's the pride of fallen mankind, that idea that we can manipulate God to do our bidding, that defamation of character, that he's just like all the other gods around us, that is what would be undone. And the purity of language would be, we would understand his character. So that's probably enough for this lesson, and I'm already looking forward to what I have for you in next week. Be blessed.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.